Good evening, everybody. My name is Dominique Bachelet. I am an associate professor in biology and ecological engineering, biological and ecological engineering at Oregon State University. And I've been a climate change scientist since 1989. In the last decade or so, I have focused my energy not only on creating content, but also designing a variety of communication tools to share climate change information. This year, it's my great pleasure to announce that the Corvallis Arts Center has generously chosen to host an art show this fall dedicated to climate change under the title, What Will Nature Do? The public media have been effective at inflating the importance of climate deniers and at focusing on the worst negative aspects of the projected changes. The writing of these journalists has been found to cause denial, numbing, apathy, and more importantly, despair and hopelessness among the young. Today, we know that climate change is here, and we have seen the youth of the world rising and demanding action to limit the negative impacts on their generation. There are many ways to envision the future, and as a modeler, I have spent quite a bit of time simulating transitions towards a world adapted to warmer conditions. Given the inertia that has followed the thousands of publications, reports, and congressional hearings, I find it essential to diversify our approach to envision the future if we want to reach a broader audience. My optimistic view is that climate change was caused by us, humans, thus bad. Many colleagues have talked about solutions and identified low-hanging fruits to get there. I am hoping that through this series of lectures by scientists who are experts in their field, artists are inspired to give us their vision of what might happen when we get people engaged in working together in a spirit of responsibility and solidarity to fix the most egregious problem we've created. Today, it is my great pleasure to introduce our fourth speaker, whom the science speakers have been tasked to inspire artists by showing us how ecosystems do function to survive adversity through adaptation and evolution. So Deke Arndt has been at NOAA's National Centers for Environmental Information and its predecessor organization, the National Climatic Data Center, since 2009. For 11 years, he has served as the chief of its climate monitoring branch. He recently transitioned to chief of the Climatic Sciences and Services Division. Deke also works with the US Global Change Research Program as co-chair of its Interagency Indicators Work Group. Prior to his time at NOAA, he worked in various capacities at the Oklahoma Climatological Survey, the State Climate Office of Oklahoma. So Deke, the floor is yours.
All right, thanks for having me, and thanks for tolerating a little bit of technical work on my end. Didn't realize my laptop battery was going so quickly, but so we scrambled. I appreciate it. I'm honored to join you, and I really look forward to sharing with you. And the thing that I think connects the issue of climate change, well, many things connect the issue of climate change and art, and that climate change is an important factor that we need to explore and understand and make our own meaning of. But it's also an issue that we share amongst all of us. And so it is, you know, as much as science can be kind of a universal, broad issue, problem, however you want to say it. And so my talk today is largely using a presentation platform, but a lot of the science that we're going to talk about is our relationship with climate, which tells us a lot about our relationship with each other. And I'd like to share a little bit just from my personal background. I'm an old meteorologist, and I grew up studying jet streams and tornadoes and stuff like that, and kind of got into climate largely by accident, and kind of fell in love with the deep relationship that we have with the climate system and how much we depend upon it. And I'm in the data business. So my organization, my institution, curates and serves a lot of data and information for folks that need it for whatever their reason. So for like Dr. Bachelet said, for 11 years, my job was to we were the scorekeepers of the, well, they still are. I was the chief of a group that is the scorekeepers of the climate system. And that's a lot of what we'll talk about, but I'll share some stories as well. And I'm going to try to share my screen, and that is not a 100% success guarantee. So here we go. I think I have it here. Can you see that?
Yes. Yep.
Oh, wonderful. Okay. All right. So just going to, I haven't even changed my title yet. We are a data center based in Asheville, North Carolina, where all of the world's weather and climate data kind of come to live in active retirement. And I'll share a little bit about that. So I am from NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. So kind of the Sea and Sky Agency in the U.S. federal government, part of the Department of Commerce. So I'm going to today just introductions, and then the three pieces that we'll talk about are: how do we know the climate's changing? How do we know humans are driving today's changes? What are some of the impacts? And this explores our relationship with the climate system and our relationship with each other. And then close with a story and on what can be a very bleak topic. In my presentation, the science parts can certainly be fairly bleak. It's a reminder, hopefully one of many stories that are told about the climate system that remind us of the power of the connection that we have with each other. Okay, so just really quickly, kind of who we are, what we do. I'm from this institution called NCEI. We're headquartered in Asheville. We have campuses in Boulder, Colorado, the Mississippi Gulf Coast, and Silver Spring, Maryland. And a lot of weather data comes into our building. And so back when this first picture was taken of someone checking a rain gauge, that data ends up in our building. It came to us on paper originally. So the person taking that observation would have written it down in a monthly ledger, folded that up, send it to what is now the Weather Service, and would have found its way into our archives, which is in our basement. Looks like the movie's getting pretty dated. It's been 40 years, but the Raiders of the Lost Ark, the big warehouse scene at the end. So we have a very large basement with lots of papers filed away with a lot of old data, and we've digitized that. We've made that into digital information that lives on computers, and that goes with, say, yesterday's weather observations. And one of the things that we can kind of uniquely do then is compare what's going on today to this deep history that we have in the past, and that's the job of our climate monitoring branch. This is more for local flavor. We used to be housed in a beautiful building, and now we're housed in what is probably be described as a nondescript federal building. But we've been this was our original location in Asheville. We moved in the 50s during the Cold War, when many vital record centers were moved out of the Washington, D.C. area and then moved to kind of lower priority targets that the Soviets would attack. And so you'll see across the government a lot of vital records centers in places like Pueblo, Colorado, and Asheville, North Carolina. And that's largely why they needed to be in places where Khrushchev wouldn't get them. So anyway, we moved into a nondescript federal building in the late 90s. So quickly, how do we know how climate is changing? And a lot of this will come from what we call climate assessments. So climate assessments are kind of compiled compendia of what's going on with the climate system. And then some of them will go into why does it matter? And what we specialize in my office is that first half of that question, trying to nail down what's going on in the climate system. So you can see several groups. IPCC, that's kind of the big global report that's issued every 5 or 6 years. The WMO, World Meteorological Organization, puts out a statement every year. We lead the State of the Climate report that you can see, the third one over from the left. That's an annual physical of the climate system, kind of a just the facts, just the numbers sort of reporting of what's going on in the climate system. And then other efforts are the National Climate Assessment, which comes out every 4 or 5 years, and that's what's represented here, climate change impacts in the U.S. And that is kind of a combination of all of the above, and then examining the America's capacity to cope with and mitigate climate change. And so there's a lot more about what it means in that National Climate Assessment. And then various other kind of specialty groups that do a lot of their own climate stuff. So the state of the climate, I got to be the lead editor, co-lead editor behind Dr. Jessica Blund and my colleague for 11 years. And I'm really missing it. This is the time that the 2020 report is. February and March is when all this kind of content comes together. And so I really miss it. But this is contributed from around the world. And one of the lessons that I learned leading this report was just the value of the connectedness of just among the scientific community around the world. So each country in color contributed at least one author to the 2019 report. The orange are chapter editors, but we get insights from about 60 nations around the world. And of course, we're always trying to expand this because there's so much knowledge that is place-based, and it's much more meaningful to curate perspectives from local scientists. Speaking of, and so this is the 2019 cover. It highlighted some issues that the big fires that occurred in Australia for a number of reasons. We did get to pick an actual artist's contribution. So Maury Pelto is a glaciologist, a glacier professor at the University of Washington, and his daughter Jill is a scientist herself, but a wonderful watercolor artist as well. And so her cover is really, they're a neat team. They're really cool. So this particular cover are 4 time series. So you can kind of pick through there, and you can see that the relief there is a time series, a graph of one of them is global temperature, one of them is sea level, one of them is sea surface temperature, and you can kind of see that she filled it in. And her art's really cool. A lot of it are cool visuals of sciencey things like data, but it really is a lot about kind of her relationship and experience with her dad, and documenting their work on these Pacific Northwest glaciers that are, retreating in retreat. And there's this kind of beautiful sense of loss and reflection, and kind of the cool part of hanging around her dad that works through her work. It's kind of fun. I don't know. You may have one of them on. I'm not sure.
Yeah. Jill will talk on March 11th.
Oh, okay. Wow. I'm her agent. Okay. Well, she's wonderful.
Thanks for the advertisement.
Yeah. That's pretty cool. Anyway, a nice place, a nice story related to climate. Okay, so I'll go a little faster through the data. If you know us, it's probably for this. One of the things we do is compute the global temperature each year. Well, we do it each month, but this is an annual graphic. And so what you see here is I'm going to show about 7 or 8 of these kind of time series, and on each one of them, there's the past is on the left and the present is on the right, and you walk in time from left to right. So at the very left of this graphic, there's a dot that reflects the temperature in 1880 of the Earth's surface, and that's 2019, actually 2020 on the 2019 on the right. Each circle is an individual year. Each of the bars is a decade's average, so just the average of those 10 years that kind of smooths out some of the noise going on there. And you can see a few things. One, the trend is clearly going up, especially since the middle of the 20th century. And then the other is, not every year is necessarily warmer than the year before it. One of the challenging things about measuring climate change is the warming manifests in different ways in different systems. And then even in something like the global temperature, because of the internal dynamics, because of the internal relationships within the climate system, it heats kind of in fits and starts. And you can see this very much in this picture. The one thing I should mention, the black line is the 20th century average. So dots that are above the black line are warmer than the 20th century average. And if they're far above the black line, they're much warmer than the 20th century average. And dots that are below the black line are cooler. So you can see a few things. Again, there's a clear warming trend. If you kind of look at the pattern rather than the individual years, you see a lot of bouncing up and down from year to year as the Earth's atmosphere and ocean and ice systems kind of trade heat. And some of that shows up as temperature jumps. Some of that shows up as temperature drops from year to year. But the long-term picture, especially represented by these decadal bars, these 10-year bars, is clearly up. Last year was really close to the warmest year on record. We are kind of friendly competitors with folks at NASA. There's a group in the UK. There's a group of the Japanese Meteorological Agency that do global temperature records, and we all kind of landed in the top two. 2020 was one of the two warmest years on record. Ours was second place by a little bit. It's easy to get hung up on ranks, and a couple of us said first warmest and a couple of us said second warmest, but it was clearly one of the warmest years on record. And that was a little bit of surprising. The way the world's atmosphere and ocean patterns were kind of set up throughout 2020 would not have lent themselves to a particularly warm year. And we wouldn't have expected to see a dot that close to the top. But we did. It was a warm year, very, very warm year. The rate of warming, it does vary around the world. So not all warming happens at the same rate in different places. The one takeaway from this this is two maps that show the rate of warming. How fast is the planet warming based on where you are? The left one is since the beginning of the 20th century. The right one shows the last 30 years, and that's as of 2019, 1990 through 2019. So you can see, there's more vivid colors on the right. So the changes have sped up over time. So the warming that we've seen in the last 30 years in most places is more at a higher rate than even the warming that we saw throughout the last 120 years. And then you can see that basically land areas and very high latitude near the pole areas in the northern hemisphere are warming faster than the rest of the planet. And that is very true for the last 50 or 60 years, not just these 30. And that has to do with the fact that snow and ice cover is going away. And as those very white reflective surfaces, which reflect the sun's energy back into the atmosphere, as those go away, they're replaced by darker surfaces underneath them, whether it's land or ocean, that absorb the sun's energy instead of reflect it. And that kind of additive effect is what we call positive reinforcement in the science, which sounds like your boss telling you you did a good job, but what it means is it adds to the cycle. So that additional factor is an additional warming influence, just because the warming's causing the snow and ice to go away, which is causing more warming locally. There's some other things going on that drive this northern hemisphere warming, but that's the main driver of that. Just even in our own country, not all of our places or all of our seasons are warming in the same way. So this is the last 30 years with of the whole year on the left, and then the four seasons: winter, spring, summer, fall on the right. And you can see, again, it's not universally consistent. Some places, even in the last 30 years, have actually seen some seasons cool a little bit, but the overall trend is up. And in the West in particular, the winter and the summer months are warming more than the other seasons. This is kind of a self-defense slide. These are the major groups that I mentioned earlier, and we all kind of in a friendly competition try to calculate the global temperature and do the best job we can. And this is a few years old, but the story hasn't changed. And you can see these three groups. These are the three, NOAA, NASA, and the UK Met Office. And those are our three lines all on top of each other. And you can see in an individual year, they may be slightly different. We may be hitting different notes in individual years, but we're all singing the same song. And that really helps us with our confidence that the methods that we're using, which are all three different, are coming to the same conclusion that the Earth is warming. And then the bright blue line, this works a little better in person, but the bright blue line reflects what would happen what we would see if we didn't adjust for the changes in the instrumentation. And in particular, the dominant one is the way observing the oceans changed with the advent of World War II, where they used to throw buckets over the side of boats. And then in World War II, that was a very dangerous job. And they went to measuring ocean water in the engine room as the water came in to cool the engine room. And we adjust for that. So you've probably heard or may have heard that scientists adjust the data. The fact is we adjust it. If we left it by itself, you would see that light blue line, which is actually a slightly steeper curve. So contrary to what you may hear, our adjustments actually reduce the warming rate a little bit. When we correct for these things, the world, at least according to our calculations, is warming at a slightly less rate than the raw data. So we are taking into account a lot of these issues. And there are people that have spent careers on this homogenization work. That's really good stuff. The Arctic, represented here in the blue line versus the same global temperature that we looked at earlier in the red line. The Arctic temperature is warming faster in recent years. So you see a steeper climb in the blue line. That represents all of the areas in the world north of 60 degrees north, which is up there. That's very near the Arctic Circle. And then again, as that snow and ice goes away, and that highly reflective surface goes away and reveals more darker, more absorbent surfaces underneath, it is warming the Arctic up quite a bit faster. The Arctic, in a lot of ways, is the crucible of where change is happening the most quickly and the most dramatically. It's now we're kind of getting into overkill with the graphs. I promise the graphs are going to stop soon. But without getting into details, Arctic sea ice is going away. These are measurements of sea ice extent, the size of the footprint of Arctic sea ice in March in black, in September in red. Over time, the sea ice kind of breathes in and out each year. At March, it typically reaches its maximum extent after, at the tail end of the cold season, and then melts away during our Northern Hemisphere summer to a minimum footprint in September. And what we see is that smaller late summer footprint is diminishing the fastest. So we will still see winter sea ice quite a bit. Summer sea ice is becoming a much smaller factor in the world's climate, and that has follow-on effects for wildlife. We've seen mammals like walruses and polar bears that are affected by sea ice changes. We also, if you live in a coastal community in Alaska and you're typically very connected to sea ice in the way that it brings the timing of your whaling or other activities, it's tough. And as sea ice goes away, and what we're not showing right here is as the permafrost, the permanently frozen soils in a lot of coastal Alaskan region go away. That means you get a lot more wave action on the coast, which is highly erosive. And we're literally losing soil in coastal communities and evacuating several communities at great cost financially, but also at great cost to heritage and connection with a place. We're moving communities inland quickly as the soils erode. This is that, and I will skip that. And I'm showing a picture here in the U.S. of a glacier, which is kind of an ornamental glacier in Glacier National Park. And over the course of about 100 years, it has largely disappeared. So the photo on the left is from 1911. The photo on the right is from 2005. You can maybe see some red lines of relief that mark where the glacier extent was in the left photo, and you can see how little of that is remaining. And this is a sad loss in North America, where this is, there's ecosystem loss, and then there's just a kind of a loss associated with wonder at nature. But it's important to note around the world, there's about 1 billion people, particularly in Asia, that rely on the timing and the volume of floodwater or from meltwater from glaciers. And as glaciers are going away, the timing and the volume are changing. And so if you've relied that, if you tuned your culture to counting on the meltwater for domestic or agricultural purposes, and that changes, those are the communities where losing a glacier is more than kind of sadness at looking at a picture. Losing a glacier, or losing the location of where the meltwater starts, or the timing of what that meltwater starts, is losing a powerful kind of economic factor in your quality of life. Much more important. About 1 billion people around the world are connected to the timing of glaciers. And as they go away, it's more than just exposing rock. It's changing lives. The last, I think, global ocean heat content and sea level are also going up. So ocean heat content measures how much energy is kind of trapped in the upper slabs of the ocean. This 700 meter, that's about, oh no, I have to do math in my head. That's a little more than 1/4 of a mile, I believe, slab on top of the ocean. And that's where the vast majority of the additional warming caused by greenhouse gases is going, is into the upper layers of the ocean. It's kind of the savings account, so to speak, of change. So we see about 90% of the additional energy going into the ocean, and we're feeling about 10% of the additional warming in real time in the atmosphere. And sea level rise is going up because warmer water expands, and because ice sheets over land are melting new water into that ocean. So the combination of those are causing sea levels to go up. All right, so that's all pretty depressing. So how do we know it's our fault? How do we know that humans are driving the changes that we see, and this isn't just some natural thing? So first of all, we kind of drove by some of these, but here are 10 indicators, and they are in unison saying the world is warming. So temperatures are going up. We have more humidity in the atmosphere. Sea level and sea surface temperature are going up. The heat content in the ocean is going up, and frozen stuff is going down. And all of those together show that that the world is warming, but they don't really say why. And so it's important we assert, why, how we know. Well, for one thing, we know physics, and we've known for about 150 plus years that greenhouse gases will warm that increasing greenhouse gases will warm the planet, and we've just gotten kind of more refined in that knowledge and started putting numbers on it in the last century or so. So these are the 3 main drivers of change on the left, and they're reduced to graphics, and that's kind of a sterile way to represent these factors that are driving great changes around the world, but that's the way that we do it in science and climate monitoring anyway. And so the 3 gases that are driving the changes the most are carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide, which are 1, 2, 3 on that graph order. And you can kind of see they're all going up. Carbon dioxide and methane have kind of an annual cycle as the northern hemisphere greens up and pulls those gases out of the atmosphere. Temporarily kind of goes down, and then as the northern hemisphere breathes out, and we see a lot of the green stuff go dormant for the cold season, a lot of that carbon dioxide is shared back with the atmosphere. So that's the annual cycle that you see in the black traces of those two. But you can see the long-term trend is up. The reason carbon dioxide is the greenhouse gas that everyone worries about, actually the other two, methane and nitrous oxide, are more potent pound for pound. So a pound of methane and a pound of nitrous oxide is going to cause a lot more warming than a pound of carbon dioxide. The reason CO2 is the gas that everyone worries about is there's a lot more of it. It's measured in parts per million rather than parts per billion. And it lasts a lot longer. It's a very, very stable gas chemically. It's hard to unmake carbon dioxide once it's made. And so it lasts a long, long time in the atmosphere. It's a very stable gas, and it has residence times of centuries to multiple centuries in some cases. So it takes a long time for that new greenhouse gas to kind of get accommodated by the system. And that carbon dioxide is the driver. These other two are kind of multiplying factors, but carbon dioxide is the greenhouse gas. The graphic on the right's it's kind of a weird combo look at which gases are doing how much of the warming. The bright blue is carbon dioxide, so it's driving about 2/3 of the warming that we've seen in the last 30 years or so. So how do we know? So the other way we know is we can't explain it otherwise. So what this is walking us through, again, yet another time series. I know I promised these would quit. But what we see are in the black line are what we've observed. What we see in the kind of blue envelope, the blue colors, are a bunch of computer model simulations where we have the humans turned and their greenhouse gases turned on. The green represents a bunch of computer simulations, and I mean thousands of computer simulations, where the humans and their greenhouse gas contributions are turned off. And there's really no other way for us to explain it physically, the increase that we've seen in the last several decades, rather than using the physics associated with greenhouse gases. And then finally, the smoking gun. If we didn't believe what the scientists have said over the last 150 plus years, and we didn't believe that our actual simulations of the planet, which work in most other situations and almost all situations, that nail greenhouse gas as the culprit, the smoking gun is in our observations of the atmosphere itself. So if we were completely naive to this issue, what you're looking at on the left are temperatures in the lower part of the atmosphere. It's called the troposphere, where we live. So it's the bottom 30, 35,000 feet of the atmosphere. And what you're seeing in the three panels are weather balloon, radiosondes, which are weather balloon measurements, satellite measurements in the middle, and reanalyses, computer simulations on the bottom. And then on the right, you're seeing the next layer up, the lower stratosphere. It's a slab from 35 to 40,000 feet up to maybe 70, 80,000 feet in the atmosphere. It's where most of the rest of the atmosphere is. And you're seeing, again, its temperatures measured with weather balloons on the top panel, satellites on the middle panel, computer simulations on the bottom panel. And there are some details in there related to volcanoes messing with the spikes in the stratosphere on the right. But in the big picture, you see the bottom of the atmosphere is getting warmer. The upper part of the atmosphere is getting cooler. And you could not change you couldn't warm the lower atmosphere and cool the upper atmosphere without changing the composition of the atmosphere. If it were the sun or our orbit or some other universal factor, the whole system would warm up. But the reason we're seeing the warming, we're experiencing the warming down here in the bottom of the atmosphere, is because we're trapping heat with greenhouse gases in the bottom of the atmosphere. And that image on the right is the mirror image of that. It's the cooling of the upper atmosphere as more heat is trapped in the lower atmosphere. So this is the observational smoking gun, even if we didn't have the faith in science explaining it. I think that's the end of the charts. No, it's not. I'm going to skip sea level rise, other than to say in the United States, sea level rise and this clear sky flooding phenomenon that it brings. So one of the more expensive things that we're dealing with in recent years is what's called nuisance flooding. When high tide, this is especially the case in the East, where we get clear sky, ankle deep waters during high tide days when the wind blows onshore. And that's, what was called a king tide that happened every 4 or 5 years is now happening multiple times a year in a lot of the Atlantic coast. And that, is hard on infrastructure. You don't want pipes and other stuff sitting around in salt water. And it's a real problem here. It's expensive. It costs money. In parts of the rest of the world, like say the Bay of Bengal, that salt water is ruining land that is used to grow subsistence crops, and it is devastating to people who are trying to produce agriculturally, literally to feed their families. And these nuisance floodings are making that soil infertile and causing them lots of unpleasant choices, really reducing their options on what they can do, with some pretty devastating migration and other outcomes. I'm going to skip through and get to the climate and extreme weather. This gets to our relationship with the climate. This is an eye chart. There's nothing specific on here that's important. This is kind of me keeping track during my time as the monitoring chief, which states had their warmest or coolest or wettest or driest month or season on record. And you can see a lot of red on there and not a whole lot of blue. And that means that we are poking into unprecedented extremes on the warm end much more than we're poking into unprecedented conditions on the cold end. This February's event in Oklahoma and Texas notwithstanding, those types of really cold outbreaks are getting a lot more rare. Warm outbreaks are getting a lot more common. And that's exactly what we would expect in a warming world. So just as a scientist, can't resist the urge to do a literature review. A piece of literature written 45 years ago really helps describe our relationship between a big weather and climate. It's written by a group of authors headed by a gentleman named Stallone. And here it is. The person on the left is weather, and the person on your right is climate. So the boxer is weather. Weather throws the punches, climate trains the boxer. When Rocky goes into a match, we don't know what punch he's going to throw at 2 minutes and 12 seconds left in the 7th round of his next boxing match. But we know if we change the trainer, he's going to throw a lot more left hooks over time. We know if we change the trainer, he's going to throw some punches more effectively and more often over time, and some punches less effectively and less often over time. And so the relationship between climate change and the kind of big weather events that we see is like this coach-athlete, mentor-apprentice, parent-child, teacher-student type relationship, where the parental mentor figure doesn't twist the dials and determine day-to-day outcomes, but it has a pervasive long-term effect on long-term behavior and long-term outcomes. And that's the relationship that we see clearly in the statistics between climate and weather. I'll go another few ways down the line. I have a teenage boy in my house. I'm sorry for the mid-century pop culture fest here, but I'm becoming of a certain age, this kid is an impulsive guy. He takes after his old man in that he has a short attention span. He's really sensitive to the world immediately around him. When the right set of ingredients come together, he can do extreme behavior. And then the kind of beautiful thing about him is he forgets quickly, resets, and moves on. And if we hadn't named him something else, we would have named him weather, right? So this is what weather looks like to a climate scientist. Weather is like a teenager that's impulsive, can do big things. When the ingredients come together, big things happen. That's what extreme weather looks like to a climate scientist. And that's in a stable kind of mentor climate type situation. But if you were to change the climate to some other influential figure, you would see profound changes in the behavior of the kid over the long term. But what you wouldn't see are changes in the individual things that drive his individual days or her individual days. Still going to be impulsive, still going to react to the things immediately around him. Bad days are going to be triggered by being hungry, feeling alone, feeling scared about something, being under stress. The same things that cause bad days in a stable climate are going to cause bad days in a changed climate or a changing climate. It's just those ingredients are going to come together more often. And so climate change brings in brings the same ingredients as far as extreme weather goes, but brings them often together in new ways, more intensely, perhaps more often. And it depends on kind of the piece of the climate system, which of those is the case. So again, the things that cause extreme events are mostly the same, but the trajectory of the long term has changed. The extreme events are going to become more often. I will spare you this graphic. It's yet another graphic about the shifting sands of time. And I will go straight to things like extreme, well, I'll go back. Actually, let's talk about, this is a measure of morning time temperature in the summer months in the United States. And each bar represents how much of the US had extremely warm or extremely cool for summer morning time temperatures, minimum temperatures, overnight lows. And one of the strongest signals we see in the US is that overnight lows in the summer are warming faster than overnight highs in the summer. In fact, that situation repeats itself in kind of a 3 out of 4, 4 out of 5 kind of way throughout our relationship with the climate. The cooler places, the cooler seasons, the cooler times of day are warming faster than the warmer places, the warmer seasons, the warmer times of day. And this graphic is just kind of one way of teasing that out. You can see that summer mornings in the United States are warming kind of dramatically. And we could talk about the meteorology that drives any one of those kind of summer episodes, but the long-term trend is clear. And morning temperature is not an attractive kind of element. You know, an afternoon temperature in the triple digits is splashy and attention grabbing, whereas an overnight temperature of 78 in Atlanta doesn't seem as big. But if you're in Atlanta, or if you're in anywhere and you're struggling to pay your bills anyway, and you have to make choices like, do I cool my home so I can sleep tonight, or do I eat tomorrow? Or do I cool my home so I can sleep tonight, or do I pay, you know, can I afford that electric bill? Then that overnight low during the summer becomes a pressure point on the vulnerable among us. And, you know, or if you work on a roof in the morning, and you get fatigued more quickly because the sun came up and it was already 78 degrees instead of 71 degrees. If you're a person who works on a roof in the morning, and because of the environment around us, you don't feel safe and secure getting medical attention when you do maybe experience some heat illness, then that is climate change pressing harder on the more vulnerable among us. And like a lot of ecological and environmental factors, climate change aggressively pursues the poor, the vulnerable, and the uninformed, more so than the fortunate and the informed. It's the same for precipitation. A warmer atmosphere holds more water vapor. An atmosphere with more water vapor can deliver more water vapor to a storm system that creates rain. A storm system that creates rain, when it has more water vapor, is going to make more rain. And because of the combination of these effects over time, we are seeing that the biggest rains are getting bigger, and that more and more of our annual rainfall is coming in the form of big rains. And that has obvious implications in the kind of frequency and intensity of flash flooding. But in the West in particular, it also has implications for if a lot of our water is coming out of the mountains and we build dams to hold that back and to use it during the summer. It's harder to keep, it's harder to hold on to water that comes really flashy rather than gently out of the mountains. You know, it's a completely different strategy. Yesterday's dams were not necessarily built for today's climate. Add to that on top that the snow melt is happening a little earlier and a little more rapidly, and our kind of winter and spring snows that we use in the West for our summer water. That's a complicated, the combination of these two are really complicating. I will skip that and go to a story in the interest of time here. We could talk about hurricanes. While there aren't necessarily more hurricanes, the hurricanes that we are getting more intense. They're slower, they're bigger, they make more rain, and that means they deliver a lot more flooding inland when they make landfall in the U.S. I do want to close with a story. It's about our relationship with each other and with the climate. So if I can share, I am from Oklahoma. I grew up in Oklahoma. It's my first 40 years in Oklahoma. And, you know, a part of our climate history, it drove huge migrations. We lost a fifth of our population to migration during the 1930s, during the Dust Bowl. So you see one of these classic dust storms going on the left here. That's the migrant mother, Florence Owens, iconic picture, photograph, portrait from the time she was in a migrant camp in California, came from Southern Plains, my part of the world. They wrote novels about the suffering and kind of the injustices and the calamity of the Dust Bowl. And it is true. I mean, growing up in Oklahoma, it is the event, or at least since white settlement, it was the event that is the schism before and for which there's a before and an after. It was devastating to the state's psyche. You can see the ramifications of it play out in the state's politics even still today. You can certainly, it is the event. It is the event that defines before and after in the state's history since statehood. So I just personally, you know, the girl that's standing on your left, her right, that's my grandmother, Vivian Grubus. Idris Grubus at the time. She changed her name to Vivian later. That's probably her little sister on the lap. That's Gladys Grubus. And that's probably their mom, birth mother, Ludi Holly, sitting there with them. And these were during good times in Crowder, Oklahoma in the mid 1920s. And so, you know, roughly 6-7 years after this portrait was taken, what happened was things went bad, environmentally, ecologically, economically, and like a lot of families in the region at the time, Ludi Holly, for whatever reason, decided that she could no longer go on as the stable mother of the household. And my grandmother ended up being the head of the household as a teenage girl dragging her little sister around the Dust Bowl in a pretty desperate time and place. And it went about as well as you would expect that to go. They bounced from house to house, from neighbor to neighbor, from relative to stranger, and kind of just made it through the era. And I know my grandmother, you know, she shared this in her last years. That was really taxing on her. There was some bad men in her life. And it was a pretty crummy chapter, but it wasn't unique. This happened at hundreds of thousands of families across the plains during the Dust Bowl. And the reason I'm sharing this is because if you were going to ask any of my climate science buddies to analyze the state of Oklahoma's drought history, they would look at all of the data and they would say, you know what, I found that drought that wrecked so many houses, altered so many lives, fostered such a time of desperation. And it stands out clear as day. And the worst drought in Oklahoma history is clearly and obviously the one that Oklahoma experienced in the 1950s, which it wasn't. Something happened between the 1930s and the 1950s that allowed that part of the world to do a better job absorbing a harder punch, to go back to our Rocky analogy, a harder punch from Mother Nature in the 1950s, without the calamity, without the collapse. And so what happened between the 30s and the 50s says less about kind of the climate system, the ecology, and so much about our relationship with it and our relationship with each other. Because what happened between the 30s and the 50s was we, in the wake of the calamity that was the 30s, we examined and started to address some of the factors that caused that calamity. And it wasn't a drought. The drought was the trigger. The calamity was waiting to happen. The drought was the trigger. So from kind of an ecological standpoint, we learned a lot about how we manage water in agricultural lands, and how we protect that water, and how we work the soil to protect that water. And we learned a lot about soil management, and we learned a lot about crop selection and making good business decisions based on the information that we have about the climate system. Oh, and we invented a discipline called home economics, which helps us understand things like how to balance our checkbook, plan our payments, make a pound of flour last a little longer. We invested in narrowing the gap between the haves and have-nots, so that all of the manual laborers that helped make agriculture happen in the 20s, that got left behind by automated mechanized farming, we invested in reducing the gaps between the haves and have-not. We invested in education, practical education that addressed all of these issues. And we worked in the communities to help bring this new understanding into play. And the reason that the 50s survived the droughts much more healthily than the 30s is because it was a better time to live. We even fixed things that are more esoteric, like, family values and believing in institutions. These things came about not by accident, but because the sons and the daughters of the folks who were able to stick around from the 30s helped make these investments so that that generation could make it through this supposedly worst punch in the 50s. And one of those people was my grandma. And she raised a family in a farm town in the 50s, and it was droughty times, and it wasn't easy, and there was hardship, but they weren't spewed out of the bottom of the economy like she had been 20 years before. The fabric held because we invested in the fabric. And I think if there's any telling thing from any of this, if you are working on climate change in however you do your thing, you're investing in possibilities that will manifest throughout generations. I'm speaking to you today from across the country as some supposed expert on climate change. I would not have this opportunity if it weren't for those investments that we're looking at between those two blue bars right there. I owe my well-being, I owe my chance to share with you today to a lot of good folks who put in a lot of little work that resonates and magnifies and amplifies over generations. And if you do get caught up in the climate change topic and you do apply your talent, I'm going to thank you on behalf of kids like me that aren't even born yet. They're gonna owe you a debt of gratitude. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Deke. I really appreciate your talk, especially the ending. At first, it was really doom and gloom, and I was like, uh-oh, I've promised everybody it would be a positive series. But your story really brought it all back. And thank you. Thank you for your time, and thank you for preparing this for us. I really appreciate it.
I just, and the thing that the first 35 minutes and the last 10 minutes share are there two different times, both of which had a lot of scary things that seemed like the end of the world. And it was the fabric among us that pulled us through the first one. And I think that's going to be the fabric among us that is an important one in today's problem.
Yeah, and we all will do our part. So I'm going to ask you a first question. How how important do you feel it is for lay people to know about your research? And everybody else can write their question into the chat box, and I will read that to Deke so he can answer your questions.
10 years ago, the answer would be different. 10 years ago, our job was to kind of hold the middle ground. And while the crazy kind of national conversation went on about the validity of whether climate change was something that was going on, that was kind of our role, is to be the scorekeepers during that. I think now that the importance of our work has more to do with helping people cope with the changes that are coming, that are here because of climate change. And, I'm glad you asked that question. I was just talking with some colleagues today about how our challenge, our big challenge, my group's big challenge related to climate change is less and less about kind of defending the truth that it's happening, and more about helping our information shine a light on the truth of how people are going to be affected by it, and hopefully how they can deal with it.
And so how do you think artists are going to help you communicate those results?
Because artists are skilled and talented in conveying what matters among us. And it's going to be what happens among us and between us. And I think the artists can bring a great deal of awareness and empathy and inspiration to find each other and to do the best things that we can. So a lot of these graphs lay on top and kind of sanitize a lot of damage that's going on underneath them, and they don't shine a light on the things that can bring us to a better place either. And I think artists, there are a few professions that in America especially, that think about our durability as people, our relationships over time, these generational issues. And I think artists are in that camp. This is an issue that's going to really drive us to move away from thinking about, the quarterly profit report, and more about the durable value of our relationships, and what do we invest in, and how do we solve a long-term problem over time. And artists may not be the only community, but they're one of few communities that maybe even think about where we're going to be, what matters, what lasts, what is universal, what is enduring. If those things jive with you, you're a good artist, but you're also not your typical American. And we need your voice in that perspective, I think, in this this issue that we're going to be tackling for decades.
Yes. Somebody asked, will we be able to access the background information graphs at all somewhere? So we are recording your presentation, so that's going to be available on the Art Center website. But I've put in the chat box, I've put that, your website, your professional website is indicated under your name on the Art Center website. And so if people want to email you, I told them that they could.
Okay, super. Please do.
Yeah. And that's something that most of the speakers have told me too. It's like, if artists want to communicate between now and the moment they deliver their art, most of the speakers are more than willing to share whatever can be useful for artists to design their piece. So.
And I'm happy to share. You've already paid for it once. So it is public domain stuff. I'm from the government and I'm here to help. So.
Okay. So what do you find beautiful in your research subject?
I have found, I think, kind of what I spoke about at length at the end. I found the connectedness among researchers and just real people too, is, this thing that we measure. I'm in the measurement business more than the research business, but these things that we measure, and these phenomena that we research are happening all around us. And I think, you know, there are disciplines that do great things, and they look at very tiny things. And climate science is about these really big, sweeping relationships, encompassing, you know, relationships that are subtle and pervasive, and, you know, kind of in direct contrast with this terrible virus that we're going through, which has a really like direct, obvious, you know, impact that we, you know, can focus our attention on. Climate change is a tough issue. It's subtle, it's pervasive, it's cruel in its subtlety. It's cruel because it adds, for a lot of people, another weight for those who are already weighted. And, you know, that is another, it is another increment on those who are heavy burdened. And I think that just causes, the more you think about that, it causes you to think more and more about our relationships with each other. What do we value? And this thing that we are all observing and trying to figure out and trying to put science is ultimately, you know, it's not a science story. When we look back at this era of climate change in the 20th and 21st century, it's not going to be a science story or a technology story or even a history. It's an anthropological story. It's going to expose our relationships with each other and what we value and who we value and why we value that and what we did about it. And, you know, fundamentally strip away all of the science and the technical aspects of it. That's what's going on. Is we are in an era that's exposing how much we care about our fellow man and the planet and animals, if you're into that. That's pretty deep stuff, you know. But that's what we're going through.
So what was the most surprising thing you've ever found in your job?
That's a good question. Unfortunately, we haven't been surprised by much with the climate system. I'll have to go kind of back to a previous job. Back when I was in Oklahoma, I worked a lot with emergency managers. And I think, you know, we worked a lot of, it was weather, it wasn't really, it hadn't have a lot to do with climate, it's like weather preparedness stuff. And I think the thing I learned, so I ran a program where we trained emergency managers to kind of take in weather information and make decisions in the face of, you know, wildfire, severe weather, and everything. And it was really like, I think the empowerment of, you know, the empowerment of stopping and pausing and, you know, realizing that learning and helping more about the climate system really empowered those women and men to do a better job. And it's not that weather and climate is the important part of their job. It's not, but that they have really complex professions where they like manage and analyze risk all the time. And by adding just a little bit of kind of just by stopping what we do, by them stopping what we do and doing exactly what we're doing here in a systematic way. Let's have some classes about weather. And here's how you can learn. Here's how, teach us what you do on your job. We'll teach you a little bit about what we know of the weather. That we, as partially as a result of that, but mostly because of good luck, we went through a stretch in Oklahoma where we went 8 years without losing a person to a tornado. And that, I think, spoke a lot to preparedness and kind of the power of different communities getting together and working towards shared goals.
Cool. Can you speak about shifting baseline syndrome, where we lose sight of history and assume the now is now the norm?
I haven't heard it that way, but I think, you know, we're about to contribute to that problem. another office within my organization releases the normals every year or every 10 years. So when you hear the weather person say the normal high today is 72 and, the actual observed high, we update those every 10 years. And those normals are going to get warmer because it's based on the last 30 years of information. And that is one of many that was something that was designed before the pace of climate change was really appreciated, and it kind of renormalizes everything, which is I think what you're getting at, Bruce. I don't know. I don't know what the answer to that is. In some ways, especially like in ag and some types of resource management, it's tough because that shifted baseline is kind of the climate we're playing in now, and it's kind of what we have to work with, and we lose track of the deeper history. One of the ways that we try to preserve some of that in our shop, I don't know if it's a subtle detail, but where we could, you may have noticed or may have not noticed that I used the 20th century average as the baseline for a lot of the global temperature and the US temperature and precip stuff. And it is exactly, we're not changing that. We're keeping the 20th century as our baseline when we're talking about climate change, because it's fixed in time and people know what the 20th century was. So the combination of those two factors is, we're consciously trying to not move those goalposts and keep up with the climate. Now, with things like normals, your horticultural zones, your ag, your crop selection, your varieties that you work with, those necessarily, those things, the types of plants that we grow in our front yards, we can't plant those plants don't have a longing for the past like maybe some people do, and so we kind of have to work in the present with that. But it's a tough factor. I think that happened in Texas this last month. If you look at the temperatures in Oklahoma and Texas, where it got really, really cold, it was a kind of a marginal record-setting event for single days in some of the places. But as far as like a cold outbreak, kind of compared to other cold outbreaks on the calendar, it was a cold one, but it wasn't crazy like previous generations had dealt with. And we see that a lot in the U.S., where we get these cold outbreaks that seem really, really cold, and we're not prepared for them. But they're really being compared to the last 30 or 40 years when they've become rare. Now, that was definitely a cold, big winter storm event. I don't want to, it was one for the record books, but it wasn't a crazy off the charts event when you look at the last 120 years.
How can art help us not lose track of that deeper history?
Boy, that's a good question. Way above my pay grade, but I think, there's a documentary function within art that I think is important. There's a reason, and I'm just like everyone else, that I told story through portraiture, and that's one form among many, but capturing what we know and what we don't know and what we love and what we appreciate. I think putting that to media is a beautiful thing to do. And I think that's one way to help us not lose track of that deeper history.
For the lay people who are listening to your talk, what is the one thing you want them to take away from what you've told them today?
That we are all actors with agency in a changing world. That this climate change that we are experiencing is at least partially by our own hand, and that the way that we handle it and deal with it and soften its effects on us is at least partially in our own hands. That the graphs and trajectory is not destiny, that we are actors in our story and in the story of all who follow us.
Do you have reasons for optimism looking forward?
I do. I'm a naive country boy. So I don't, yes, I do. I think we are awakening to a problem that is way worse than it was 20 years ago. And the costs of coping with it and the damage that it does to living things is way worse than it was going to be 20 years ago. But I do think that we are awakening to the reality of this problem. The real challenge is that this is a subtle, just think about all of the crazy things just America has gone through in the last 5 or 6 years. Climate change has been there chugging all along as kind of the number 2 or 3 issue in our conscience. The challenge is the sustained long-term awareness, recognition, and effort that it's going to take. This is a problem that's decades in the making and probably decades in the solution. And we are really good at getting distracted by the crises and the theater of the moment. And I think that's, if we can figure out a way to kind of take the long view, the wise view on this, and we will.
Great. Thank you so much, Deke. I really loved your talk. It was great.
Thanks for having me.
Our pleasure. And thank you for taking the time. I know how busy you are. So to all of those who have listened, it's like Deke's email is on the website of the Art Center. And just join me to thank Deke for a great inspirational talk.
Thanks.
And next Monday, we will have talking about fires, the bad fires and the good fires.
Okay.
Thanks again, Deke.
Have a wonderful series, Dominique. It's good to see you.
Thank you. Yeah,
right.
It's been really good to see all of you talk about, personal experiences and how everybody is responding to climate change in their own way. That's been really, really, really good.
All right. Yeah. Thank you so much. All right. Bye-bye.
Have a good night. Thanks again for being with us so late.
You bet.
Bye.